That night, at a luxurious opera gala in New York, a famous opera singer openly mocked a rock legend right in front of hundreds of elite guests. He challenged the man to step onto the stage and sing an aria, something many performers spend an entire lifetime preparing before they even dare attempt. The entire room was almost certain that they were about to witness a humiliating moment. But no one expected that. Just a few minutes later, the very man who had issued the challenge would be the one standing silent amid the thunderous applause of the entire room. That evening, Lincoln Center in New York shone brighter than usual. Crystal lights from enormous chandeliers reflected across the polished marble floor, creating an atmosphere at once majestic and slightly distant. Guests in elegant tuxedos and custom-designed evening gowns moved slowly through the hall, holding glasses of champagne and speaking in voices just quiet enough to preserve the refinement expected at an elite gala. It was a fundraising event for cancer research, one of the most important evenings of the year in the world of classical arts. Tickets cost thousands of dollars, and the guest list was practically a gathering of the most influential names in American music and the arts. In that perfect setting, Jack Donovan walked in. He did not arrive the way famous people usually do. There were no cameras, no flashes, and no crowd gathering around him. There was only Jack, 66 years old, wearing a simple black coat, his long silver-streaked hair tied neatly behind his head, slowly stepping through the grand doors beside his wife, Emily. A few heads turned. Some people looked at him with curiosity, as if his face seemed vaguely familiar, but they could not immediately remember where they had seen it before. The younger guests barely recognized him. To them, Jack Donovan looked like an older man who seemed slightly out of place in such a luxurious setting. But for those who had lived through the explosive music era of the 1980s, that name once carried a special weight. There had been a time when tens of thousands of fans packed stadiums to hear Jack sing. His songs played from radios, from cars racing along highways, from crowded bars in Los Angeles, all the way to the largest stages in Europe. But tonight, there were no electric guitars, no blazing stage lights, only classical arias and the gentle conversations of high society. Jack gave a slight nod to a few people as they glanced his way, but he didn't linger. His eyes moved across the room as if searching for a quiet corner to stand in, or perhaps an exit. Emily noticed. She gently squeezed his arm. "Relax," she whispered with a soft smile. "We're only staying for a little while." Jack nodded, but there was still a cautious look in his eyes, the expression of someone who knew very well that he was standing in a world completely different from his own. On the other side of the hall, a group of people had gathered around another man, someone who seemed to draw every gaze in the room. He stood tall and confident, wearing a perfectly tailored tuxedo, his silver hair neatly combed. It was Victor Langley, one of the most famous tenor voices in America. For more than 30 years, Victor had performed in the world's greatest opera houses. His name had appeared on posters for the Metropolitan Opera and for theaters in Vienna and Milan. In the world of classical music, Victor Langley was not just a singer, he was a singer. But along with that reputation came something else, an almost unshakable belief that opera represented the highest form of musical art and that every other genre merely stood as a shadow outside the door of that world. Victor was telling a story to the group gathered around him. The way he spoke was confident, occasionally pausing to sip champagne, causing those nearby to laugh along with each of his remarks. It was the kind of laughter that was polite, a little performative, the familiar sound of high society evenings. Then, in the middle of speaking, Victor suddenly stopped. His eyes had just landed on someone across the room. Jack Donovan. A faint smile appeared on Victor's lips, not a friendly smile, not quite hostile either. It looked more like the smile of someone who had just seen an opportunity to prove something. Victor lifted his champagne glass slightly, his gaze still fixed on Jack. And only a few seconds later, he began walking toward the man who had just entered the room. Meanwhile, Jack had no idea that in just a few more steps, the quiet evening he had hoped would pass quickly was about to turn into a moment the entire room would never forget. Victor Langley was not the kind of man who quietly entered a conversation. As he moved across the hall, the people around him naturally shifted aside, like water parting for a passing ship. Not out of fear, but because Victor was accustomed to being the center of attention. He walked slowly, his champagne glass still in hand, his eyes never leaving Jack Donovan. Across the room, Jack was standing near the bar. Emily had just ordered 2 glasses of mineral water because, at his age, Jack was no longer interested in champagne the way he had been during the extravagant parties of his younger days. He was about to say something to his wife when he suddenly heard a voice behind him. "Ladies and gentlemen." The voice was loud enough for those nearby to hear, yet it still carried the polished tone expected at a gala. Jack turned around. Victor Langley was standing there, that familiar half-smile resting on his lips. He slightly raised his champagne glass toward Jack. "Well, well, if I'm not mistaken, this is Jack Donovan." Several people nearby began to pay attention. The scattered conversation slowly faded as they sensed that something was about to happen. Victor continued, his voice gentle but laced with subtle sarcasm. "A rock legend walking into an opera gala. That's certainly not something we see every day." A few chuckles came from the group standing behind Victor. Emily immediately caught the tone hidden in those words. She kept a polite smile on her face, but her eyes had grown more cautious. Jack, however, reacted differently. He stood there, looking at Victor for a few seconds. His gaze was calm, almost indifferent. Victor stepped a little closer. "Tell me something, Jack," he said, his tone so friendly it almost sounded too friendly. "Have you ever had any vocal training?" Someone in the crowd raised an eyebrow. The question sounded ordinary, but the way Victor asked it made everyone realize it wasn't so simple. Jack gave a small shrug. "No," he replied briefly. Victor nodded, as if confirming something he had already known. "Ah, I thought so." He turned to the people around him. "You see, to become an opera singer, we train for decades." He placed a hand on his chest as if explaining a fundamental truth. Breath control, technique, vocal discipline, all of it requires years of study and dedication. Then Victor looked back at Jack. "But rock music is different, isn't it?" A short silence settled into the air. Victor tilted his head slightly. "All you need is an electric guitar, a microphone, and the ability to shout really loud." A few people laughed, not everyone. Some exchanged uneasy glances, sensing that the conversation had begun to go further than it should. Emily gently tightened her grip on Jack's arm. But Victor was not finished. He pointed toward the large stage at the far end of the hall, where a Steinway grand piano stood beneath the lights. "In fact," Victor said, his voice light as if suggesting an amusing idea, "tonight we have a wonderful stage right over there." He took a sip of champagne, then smiled. "So, why not make this evening a little more interesting?" The small crowd around them fell silent. Victor continued, "Jack, why don't you go up there and sing an aria for us?" The moment the words left his mouth, the atmosphere in that corner of the hall changed instantly. Everyone understood exactly what it meant. This was not an invitation. It was a challenge. A challenge was issued in the middle of a room filled with classical artists, a place where opera was considered the highest form of musical art. Emily leaned closer and whispered, her voice barely loud enough for Jack to hear, "We don't have to stay here." But Jack remained still. He looked at Victor, not angry, not defensive, just quiet. Victor folded his arms, his expression almost certain that the story had already ended. He believed Jack would do one of two things: either refuse or look like an outsider, or accept and turn himself into a joke in the middle of an opera hall. Victor could not imagine a third possibility. But in that very moment, Jack Donovan slowly let out a long breath and said something no one in the room expected. "All right." Victor blinked. Jack looked straight at him. Then he calmly asked, "Where's the stage?" The moment Jack Donovan said the words, "Where's the stage?" the atmosphere in the hall seemed to freeze. For several seconds, no one spoke. Victor Langley blinked as if wondering whether he had heard correctly. The confident smile was still on his lips, but a tiny crack had appeared in it, a subtle sign of surprise he had not managed to hide. Around them, the conversation slowly faded away. Guests in tuxedos and evening gowns began turning their heads toward them, sensing that something unusual was unfolding. Emily looked at her husband, her eyes filled with both concern and understanding. After more than 40 years beside Jack, she had learned one thing. When he had that look, calm yet determined, almost nothing could make him change his mind. Victor cleared his throat softly, trying to maintain his composure. "Well, if you really want to," he said, his tone light as though everything were still under control. "The stage is right over there," he gestured, toward the far end of the hall. There, beneath warm golden lights, a Steinway grand piano stood quietly, surrounded by a small chamber orchestra prepared for the evening's program. Jack nodded. Without saying another word, he began walking toward the stage. Each step was slow but certain. Guests standing on either side naturally moved aside, forming a narrow path. Some raised their hands to whisper to one another. Others began pulling out their phones as if sensing they were about to witness a memorable moment. Up front, Victor returned to his seat in the front row. He sat down, folding his arms across his chest, his eyes fixed on Jack. In his mind, the outcome of this little story already seemed inevitable. A rock singer? Performing opera? It would turn into a performance no one would want to remember. But Jack no longer looked at Victor. As he climbed the steps leading to the stage, the spotlight shone down on him, making his silver hair glow faintly. In that moment, he no longer looked like a misplaced guest at a gala. He looked like someone who had stood on many stages in his life, even if none of them had been opera stages. Jack walked toward the microphone placed at the center of the stage. 500 pairs of eyes were watching him. Some curious, some skeptical, some even slightly sympathetic, as though they were waiting for an awkward moment to unfold. Jack picked up the microphone. He did not speak immediately. Instead, he looked around the hall, his gaze moving across the rows of seats, across the many faces. Then he spoke, his voice low and rough but clear. "I know everyone came here tonight to hear opera." A few people in the audience nodded faintly. Jack continued, "I've never studied opera, never attended a conservatory, and I'm certainly not an opera singer." A few chuckles rose from somewhere in the back. Jack didn't mind. He placed his hand on the piano, gently touching the polished wood as if greeting an old friend. "But I believe music doesn't always have to be perfect." He paused for a moment. "Sometimes it just needs to be honest." The words fell into the hall like a drop of water landing on the surface of a still lake. No one spoke. Jack turned toward the pianist seated at the instrument. He leaned down and whispered a few words into the man's ear. The pianist's eyes widened. Clearly, he had never expected Jack Donovan to request that particular piece. He hesitated for a second. Then he nodded. His fingers touched the keys. The first piano notes began to flow out, slow and solemn. A few musicians in the orchestra instantly recognized the melody. Some people in the audience did as well. And as the melody spread throughout the room, Victor Langley suddenly sat up straighter. Because it was not a rock song, not a ballad. It was Nessun Dorma, one of the most famous and most difficult arias in the history of opera. The entire room held its breath. Because if Jack Donovan truly intended to sing that piece, then he was either about to create an extraordinary moment or a disaster in the middle of the most elegant gala of the year. The first notes of Nessun Dorma spread through the hall like a slow, rising wave. It was a melody that any opera lover could recognize instantly. A famous aria by Puccini, beautiful enough to feel almost sacred, and difficult enough that even the world's greatest tenors prepare carefully before daring to perform it. And now, a rock singer was standing at the microphone, preparing to sing it. In the front row, Victor Langley leaned slightly forward. His eyes no longer carried the mocking expression they had held a few minutes earlier. Instead, they had become sharper, the gaze of a man observing an experiment he was certain would fail. Back near the wings of the stage, Emily stood silently. She knew Jack better than anyone else in that room, but even she did not know exactly what was about to happen. Jack closed his eyes for a few seconds, not out of fear, but like someone listening to something very distant, very deep in his memory. Then he opened them, and he began to sing. The voice that emerged was not overly loud, not theatrical, just a rough, low tone carrying the raw texture of a man who had lived through many years. At the first note, a few people in the audience exchanged glances. They were listening, but still unsure of what they were hearing. Jack did not sing like an opera singer. He did not try to imitate the flawless technique of professional tenors, but every line he sang carried something else. Emotion. The kind of emotion no music school could ever teach. As the melody rose, Jack's voice grew stronger. Not perfect, not polished according to classical standards, but honest enough that no one could look away. Near the back of the hall, a woman slowly placed her hand on her chest, as if she had just realized something. The orchestra began to join in. Violins stretched their notes, lifting Jack's voice higher. The pianist glanced at him once, a trace of astonishment in his eyes. He had played this piece hundreds of times, yet he had never heard it sung quite like this. Jack did not look at the audience. He gazed into the distance as if he were seeing somewhere else, another time. As the song neared its climax, the atmosphere in the hall transformed completely. The people who had laughed minutes earlier were now silent. Those who had been skeptical were now listening. And Victor Langley, the man who had issued the challenge, was sitting upright in his chair. The arrogance had disappeared from his eyes. Only absolute attention remained. Then the moment arrived, the climax of the aria. Jack took a deep breath and sang the final line. Vincerò. I will win. His voice filled the hall. It was not the perfect sound of a trained opera singer, but it carried the weight of a man who had experienced both the highest peaks and the deepest valleys of life. The sound rose upward, echoing against the hall's high ceiling before slowly dissolving into silence. When the final note faded, the entire room fell quiet. No applause, no whispers, just silence. 3 seconds, 5 seconds, 10 seconds. And then, from the back rows, someone stood up. A burst of applause followed. Then another person stood, and within just a few seconds, the entire 500-person audience rose to their feet, the applause crashing through the hall like a powerful wave. But Jack Donovan remained standing on the stage. He had not stepped away from the microphone. Because the story, it was not over yet. The applause continued to echo throughout the hall. The crystal chandeliers hanging from the ceiling trembled slightly with the rhythm of hundreds of people rising to their feet. A few guests wiped tears from their eyes, not even realizing when they had begun to fall. But Jack Donovan remained still. He did not bow. He did not raise a hand to acknowledge the audience. He stood quietly at the microphone, his eyes fixed on a point somewhere in the middle of the hall. Gradually, the applause began to slow. Then it faded. The entire room fell silent again, but this time it was not the silence of doubt. It was the silence of respect. Jack brought the microphone a little closer. His voice was slightly rough, but clear. "I didn't choose this song because it's famous." He paused for a moment. "I chose it because it once saved me." The entire hall grew still. Jack turned his head toward the wings of the stage. Emily was still standing there, her hands clasped in front of her chest, her eyes red with tears. He looked at her for a few seconds before continuing. "In 1993, we were in a small hospital room in Chicago. No one in the hall moved. The doctors told us that Emily had cancer. Several people in the audience slowly lowered their heads. Jack continued, his voice slowing as if each word carried an old memory. Those days were long. The nights were even longer." He took a soft breath. "And every night, this song played from an old radio in that hospital room." Some people in the audience were beginning to understand. Jack gave a faint smile. "Nessun dorma. Vincerò. I will win." He looked at Emily. "We listened to it every night. Not because it was opera, not because it was famous, but because we needed to believe those words were true." A quiet moment passed. Then Jack added, his voice gentle but steady. "And in the end, she won." Emily broke into tears. Not loud sobs, just silent tears slowly running down her cheeks. The hall remained silent, but this time that silence carried a different feeling. It was no longer a luxurious gala, no longer a debate about opera or rock. It was simply the story of two people who had fought a battle in their lives. In the front row, Victor Langley slowly stood up. His arms were no longer folded. The confident smile he had worn earlier was gone. Now there was only one emotion in his eyes: acknowledgement. Victor walked onto the stage. Each step echoed softly against the wooden floor, drawing the attention of many people in the room. He stopped in front of Jack. The two men stood facing each other under the lights. One was an opera singer who had been trained for over 30 years. The other was a rock singer who had never set foot in a conservatory. Victor looked at Jack for a few seconds. Then he spoke, his voice low, but loud enough for the entire hall to hear. "I was wrong." No excuses, no explanations. Just 3 simple words. Victor extended his hand. Jack looked at it. Then he took it. It was not the handshake of two performers. It was the handshake of two men who had just realized something important. That sometimes, music does not need to be perfect to become art. It only needs to be sung with a truly honest heart. After that handshake, applause once again filled the hall. But this time the sound no longer carried the excitement of a successful performance. It held a different feeling, deeper, more sincere. The people standing in the audience were not simply applauding a song, they were applauding a moment that had made them rethink something about themselves. Jack Donovan gave a small bow of gratitude, then stepped back slightly to give Victor Langley some space. Victor stood still for a few seconds, looking down at the audience. In more than 30 years on opera stages, he had grown used to applause. He had heard ovations that were longer, louder, more thunderous. But never had applause felt as heavy as it did at that moment. Victor picked up the microphone. His voice was lower than usual. "I have spent my entire life categorizing music," he said slowly. "Opera here, classical music here, and everything else somewhere below." He paused and glanced toward Jack. "But tonight, this man reminded me of something I should have known a long time ago." Victor turned back to the audience. "Music does not care where you were trained. It does not care which genre you come from." He gave a slight nod toward Jack. "It only cares whether you sing with your heart." The hall fell silent. Then Victor placed the microphone down. No one said anything else. But everyone understood that what had happened that night had gone far beyond an ordinary charity gala. It had become a story the people present would tell for many years afterwards. 1 week later, a phone video recorded by an audience member began circulating online. At first, it received only a few thousand views, then a few 100,000, then millions. Newspapers began publishing similar headlines. "Rock legend sings opera at charity gala." But Jack Donovan did not give interviews. He did not appear on television, and he did not try to turn the moment into a personal victory. Emily posted only a single photo on social media. It showed Jack standing on the stage, eyes closed, microphone in hand. Below it was a short caption: "Music knows no boundaries." 6 months later, a handwritten letter arrived at Jack's house. The sender? Victor Langley. The letter was more than 10 pages long. In it, Victor wrote about his arrogance over the years, about how he had grown accustomed to judging others based on their musical genre. He admitted that the moment that night had made him see music in a completely different way. At the end of the letter, Victor proposed a charity concert, opera and rock, on the same stage, for cancer research. Jack finished reading the letter. Then he said one sentence: "Tell him I'm in." 1 year later, at Carnegie Hall, two musical worlds that had once stood on opposite sides of the stage now stood together. Victor Langley performed classic operatic arias. Jack Donovan sang his rock ballads, and at the end of the concert they performed Nessun Dorma together. That night they raised more than $1.3 million for cancer research. But the number was not what people remembered most. What people remembered was the moment when an opera singer and a rock legend stood side by side, singing the same song, proving something very simple. Sometimes the boundaries between musical genres exist only in our minds, and real music will always find its way to the human heart. After the concert at Carnegie Hall, life gradually returned to its normal rhythm. Victor Langley continued his opera seasons. Jack Donovan returned to the small studio behind his house in the suburbs of New York, the place where he liked to sit for hours with his old guitar, experimenting with new melodies that might never be released. But even though each of them returned to his own world, both men knew that the gala that night had changed something inside them. For Victor, the change came slowly, but clearly. In the past, he had always viewed music like a ladder, with opera standing at the highest step and other genres somewhere below. But after that night, he began to listen to music differently. One evening, Victor mentioned in an interview that he had been driving along a California highway when an old rock song came on the radio. In the past, he probably changed the station immediately. But this time, he let the song play until the end. Not because the song was perfect, but because he recognized something familiar in the voice. A real emotion. As for Jack Donovan, that night did not turn him into an opera singer, and he never tried to become one. Jack was still Jack, a man who had lived through the wild years of rock music, who had stood on enormous stages, who had lost things, fallen, and stood back up again. But one small thing had changed. Sometimes when he was alone in his studio, Jack would play Nessun Dorma again, not to practice, to listen, to remember those days in the hospital when he and Emily held hands in that small room, believing that the words "Vincerò," I will win, were not just a line in a song, but a promise life itself was making. One autumn afternoon, sunlight streamed through the studio window when Emily walked in and saw Jack sitting at the piano. He was slowly tapping out a few notes. Emily smiled and asked, "Are you singing that song again?" Jack shrugged. "Not to sing it," he said softly. "Just to remember." Emily placed her hand on his shoulder. The two of them sat quietly for a few minutes. Outside the window, golden leaves drifted through the wind. Their lives had passed through many chapters, loud ones, painful ones, and even chapters that once seemed impossible to survive. But sometimes, the moments people remember most are the simplest ones. A song, a stage, a sincere sentence. Jack once told Victor during a later meeting, "People think music is about notes." He smiled gently. "But the truth is, it's about stories." Victor nodded. And perhaps that was exactly what the entire hall at Lincoln Center had come to understand that night. That behind every voice, every song, every artist, there is a story. And sometimes, that story is what touches the human heart the most. If this story made you pause for a few minutes to reflect, then it has done exactly what stories are meant to do. Because life is not shaped only by grand moments, but also by small ones, when people see one another with understanding. If you believe stories like this deserve to be told more often, consider sharing this video with someone you think would also feel its meaning. And if you would like to continue discovering stories about people, courage, and the moments that change lives, you are always welcome to return to Deep Life Tales. Because sometimes, the right story at the right moment can help us see the world with a different heart.